Ready for today's story? This is Dark Ascent. Today, I want to tell you about a family who thought spending more than $1 million prepared them for K2. They hired the best guide they could find, but when it mattered most, the father acted like he knew better. Ultimately, the trust they placed in him would leave their bodies freezing high on the mountain forever. It was July 26, 2017. K2 sits on the border between Pakistan and China, rising to 28,251 feet above sea level. It's the second highest mountain on Earth and widely considered the most dangerous. Its upper slopes are steep, exposed, and leave almost no room for error. Deep in the Karakoram range, weather can change rapidly, turning manageable conditions into a life-threatening situation within hours. Alejandro Huber was 51 years old, born in South Africa and later settled in Colorado. He had built a logistics company from a single truck into a regional operation worth several $100 million. He was the kind of person who believed that preparation solved problems. If something stood in his way, he looked for a solution rather than a reason to stop, and that mindset had shaped nearly every success in his life. His wife, Rima, whom he had met while working overseas earlier in his career, was 48. A former competitive trail runner, she had remained in excellent shape well into her 40s. Their older son, Emil, was 24. Strong, capable, and genuinely passionate about mountaineering, he wasn't simply following his father into the mountains. Their younger son, Omar, was 21, quieter and less certain about the whole idea, but still unwilling to be the only member of the family left behind. Their personalities were different, but they shared one thing in common. They trusted Alejandro. On K2, that would prove to be one of the most important facts about the family. The family's path to K2 began during a dinner conversation in 2009. Alejandro mentioned the mountain, and unlike most passing ambitions, the idea didn't fade. Within a year, it had become a goal. Soon after, it became a project. Over the next 8 years, the family's schedule slowly began revolving around the mountain. Alejandro arranged altitude training, acclimatization trips, and expert coaching. The family invested heavily in equipment, weather forecasting services, and expedition planning. By the time everything was added together, they had spent well over $1 million preparing for a single climb. The mountains leading up to K2 were treated as qualifications rather than adventures. In 2013, the family climbed Aconcagua. 2 years later came Denali. Then in 2016, they successfully summited Broad Peak, K2's neighboring 8,000er. Each expedition reinforced the belief that their preparation was working. Alejandro documented everything: summit times, ascent rates, weather decisions, equipment performance. He reviewed the records constantly, looking for weaknesses and ways to improve. By the summer of 2017, he believed they were as prepared as any family could possibly be. After everything they had accomplished together, I think it's only natural that the rest of the family felt the same way. By the time the family filed their K2 permits for the 2017 season, they had spent an estimated $1.2 million preparing for the climb. Expedition, logistics, permits, guides, equipment transport, and support infrastructure added another $200,000. Alejandro paid for all of it without hesitation. In his mind, the spending was proof they had done everything right. The death zone on K2 begins at roughly 26,000 feet, where the air contains less than a third of the oxygen available at sea level. At that altitude, thinking slows, judgment becomes less reliable, and climbers can feel completely in control while making decisions that would seem irrational at lower elevations. One of the dangers is that the impairment itself makes it harder to recognize. The mountain's most notorious section is the bottleneck, a narrow corridor of ice and rock beneath a massive overhanging glacier. Every climber attempting the summit must pass through it twice. The longer a team remains there, the greater the exposure to something that can't be predicted or outrun. If ice breaks loose overhead, there is nowhere to hide. The danger wasn't theoretical. 9 years earlier, 11 climbers had died when an ice collapse above the bottleneck swept away fixed ropes and stranded teams high on the mountain. It remains the deadliest single day in K2's history. The summer of 2017 had already made expedition leaders uneasy. Weather patterns across the Karakoram had been unstable for weeks, and a high-pressure system many teams were counting on for a summit window was beginning to weaken earlier than expected. The Joubert family arrived at base camp in early July with a team of hired guides, all of whom had extensive high-altitude experience. The lead guide had been on K2 twice before and had multiple 8,000-meter summits to his name. Alejandro had selected him personally after speaking with several candidates and paid accordingly. After all that preparation, would most people have viewed this as recklessness? Probably not. Before acclimatization rotations began, the guide gathered the family and walked them through the expedition plan. He covered the route, camp structure, oxygen schedules, emergency procedures, and most importantly, the turnaround policy. The cutoff was 9 in the morning on summit day. If the team was behind schedule, they would descend regardless of how close they were to the summit. No debate, no exceptions. The guide emphasized the point because on K2, many fatal mistakes happen when climbers stay high for too long and end up descending through the bottleneck late in the day. At the end of the briefing, all 4 family members signed the expedition log, acknowledging the turnaround policy. The dynamic between Alejandro and the guide became apparent fairly quickly. During a planning discussion several days later, the guide raised concerns about the developing weather pattern and suggested a more conservative approach to the summit window. Alejandro listened before pulling up forecasts from the private weather service he had been paying for over the previous 2 years. In front of the group, he explained why he believed the guide was being overly cautious. When the guide referenced the bottleneck and past disasters on the mountain, Alejandro acknowledged the risks, but argued that preparation changed the equation. The family had redundant oxygen systems, years of training, experienced support, and contingency plans for nearly every scenario. To him, that was the entire purpose of preparation. The guide didn't argue. He simply adjusted his recommendation and moved on. Emil seemed convinced by his father's reasoning. It's a strange thing, isn't it? Spending years searching for an expert, only to trust him less when he tells you something you don't want to hear. The first acclimatization rotation took the family to Camp 1 at around 20,000 feet. The climb went smoothly. Everyone reached camp, spent the night, and descended without major issues. Omar mentioned a mild headache during dinner, but nobody was particularly concerned. Headaches are common during acclimatization, and Alejandro told him it was likely just his body adjusting to the altitude. By morning, it had mostly faded. The second rotation pushed the team to Camp 2 at roughly 23,000 feet, and this time Omar struggled more. The headache returned stronger than before and lingered through the evening. He lost his appetite, which stood out because he was usually the easiest member of the family to keep fed on expeditions. That night he slept poorly, waking repeatedly with nausea and a persistent feeling that something wasn't quite right. The next morning he mentioned it to Alejandro. His father wasn't dismissive, but he wasn't concerned either. Alejandro reminded him that altitude affected everyone differently and pointed out that rough nights were common during acclimatization. He even brought up Broad Peak, where Omar had experienced similar symptoms before, eventually recovering and completing the climb. The explanation sounded reasonable enough, and Omar accepted it. Then again, it's not always easy to argue with someone you've trusted your entire life. Rima wasn't as comfortable. She had spent years competing in endurance sports and knew the difference between ordinary discomfort and a body struggling to adapt. What she had seen at Camp 2 looked closer to the second category. During the descent, she quietly raised the issue with the lead guide. He agreed that Omar's symptoms were consistent with acute mountain sickness. Nothing was immediately alarming, but it was exactly the kind of pattern guides watched carefully. Headaches, nausea, poor sleep, and loss of appetite were common individually. Together, especially if they worsened at higher camps, they could become a problem. The guide told her the next rotation would be important. If Omar showed unusual fatigue, coordination problems, or signs of confusion at Camp 3, they would need to have a serious conversation about whether he should continue. Rima thanked him and left it there. She considered bringing the conversation to Alejandro, but decided against it for the moment. Maybe the symptoms would improve. Maybe this was simply part of the acclimatization process. For now, she chose to wait and see what happened on the next climb. The third rotation pushed the team to Camp 3 at around 24,000 feet, the highest point of the acclimatization process before the summit push. The ascent went reasonably well for the first several hours. Omar was slower than the others, but moving steadily. Then somewhere in the upper section of the fixed ropes between Camp 2 and Camp 3, something shifted. His pace dropped noticeably. He began placing his feet with a deliberateness that looked less like caution and more like concentration, as though each step required active thought. By the time the team reached Camp 3 and got inside the tent, he was visibly unsteady. He sat down heavily and didn't move for a long time. His headache had returned at a level he later described to Emil quietly as the worst he had ever felt. He didn't tell his father that. Maybe he didn't want to worry his father, or maybe he didn't want to be the reason the climb stopped. The trouble is, what goes unsaid can matter just as much as what gets said out loud. That evening at Camp 3, Omar had a brief episode that lasted only a few minutes. He became confused about where he was. He asked a question that didn't make sense in context, then seemed to realize it himself and fell quiet. Alejandro immediately attributed it to exhaustion. They had pushed hard on the upper section. The altitude was affecting him more than usual, and he needed rest. He adjusted Omar's oxygen flow, made sure he was comfortable, and treated it as nothing serious. When Rima later mentioned the incident to the lead guide, he made a note of it. By morning, the confusion was gone, and the headache had eased. Omar said he felt fine. The team descended to base camp without incident. During the descent, however, Rima stopped on the fixed ropes and stood motionless for several minutes, staring down the mountain. She wasn't struggling physically. She simply stood there, with one hand on the rope. The guide behind her waited. Eventually, she started moving again. Back at base camp, the lead guide requested a private conversation with Alejandro. He laid out what he had seen across the acclimatization rotations, the recurring headaches, the nausea, the poor sleep, the confusion at Camp 3, and what appeared to be incomplete recovery between climbs. His assessment was straightforward. Omar's acclimatization was not where it needed to be for a summit attempt. He recommended either extending their stay at base camp and reassessing later, or removing Omar from the summit team entirely. Alejandro listened patiently before disagreeing. He pointed out that Omar had spent 8 years preparing for this expedition, and argued that a single difficult night at altitude wasn't enough to end the attempt. To him, the Camp 3 episode was fatigue and nothing more. He said the guide was being overly cautious, and reminded him that the purpose of all their preparation was to handle situations exactly like this. The guide documented the conversation in his log. He didn't raise the issue again in those terms. At some point, all an expert can do is give their opinion. The final decision still belongs to the client. By that point, Omar had heard versions of the same explanation for years. Whenever something felt wrong, there was always a reason for it. Whenever he struggled, it was framed as part of the process. More often than not, his father had been right. As a result, Omar had gradually stopped trusting his own instincts. He felt unwell in a way he couldn't quite explain, but he had felt unwell before and been told everything was fine, so he assumed this time was no different. By the third week of July, the weather window the team had been waiting for still hadn't developed cleanly. A brief stretch of relative stability appeared around the 20th, but most guides considered it narrow and uncertain. Alejandro wanted to move. The lead guide recommended waiting for something more reliable, citing both the forecast and Omar's acclimatization concerns. Alejandro disagreed. He had spent 8 years preparing for this climb and invested more money into the expedition than many people would earn in a decade. Sitting at base camp while a possible opportunity slipped away was not something he was willing to do. The guide remained opposed, but ultimately agreed to proceed. The team left base camp on July 22nd. Progress through Camp 1 and Camp 2 was steady. At Camp 3, Omar's headache returned. This time he kept it to himself. He took painkillers, adjusted his oxygen, and continued climbing. Emil checked on him more than once and received the same answer each time. He was fine. Emil accepted that. He was the strongest climber in the group and shared much of his father's instinct to push through difficulties rather than dwell on them. The lead guide's notes from Camp 3 reflected growing concern about the team's overall margin for error. They also recorded something else. The family was fully committed to continuing, and Alejandro had made it clear that the final decision was his. The upside of having one person make the decisions is clarity. The downside is that everyone else can start second-guessing themselves instead, and that's pretty much what we're seeing here. On the night of July 25th, the team settled into Camp 4 at roughly 26,000 feet. The tent was unusually quiet. Outside, the wind had strengthened enough to rattle the fabric from time to time. Rima lay awake, listening to Omar's breathing. It was shallow and uneven. She had been listening to it for nearly an hour. More than once she considered saying something. More than once she rehearsed the conversation in her head and already knew how it would end. In the end, she stayed quiet and waited for morning. Late that evening, the lead guide woke Alejandro and told him the forecast had shifted again. The weather window was compressing faster than expected, and he recommended abandoning the summit attempt. He referenced the turnaround protocol they had agreed to at base camp and reminded Alejandro why it existed. Alejandro disagreed. He believed the window was still workable and said they had not spent 8 years preparing for this climb, only to turn around from Camp 4. The guide returned to his section of the tent after making his position clear. He recorded the conversation in his log and left the decision where it stood. The team left Camp 4 at midnight. Temperatures were around -22 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind was light, the sky was clear, and the route ahead looked manageable in the glow of their headlamps. Nothing about the conditions suggested how different the mountain would look by the end of the day. Progress was slower than expected almost immediately. Omar was struggling on sections of hard ice that would normally have posed little difficulty for him. Every step required concentration, and every movement seemed to take more effort than it should. Emil stayed close to him throughout the climb, while Alejandro maintained a steady pace farther ahead. The guides monitored the situation, but at that stage the team was still moving. At around 6 in the morning, as the first light began to appear over the surrounding peaks, above them was the most dangerous section of the route, a narrow corridor of steep ice running directly beneath the hanging glacier. The guides moved through it efficiently. The family did not. Omar needed assistance on multiple sections where his footwork had become unreliable, and one of the guides eventually clipped directly into him to help manage the ascent. His decline had been gradual over the previous week, but by now it was visible to everyone. The team finally cleared the bottleneck and entered the upper snowfields sometime after 8 in the morning. The turnaround time that had been established before the expedition was 9 o'clock. It had been discussed repeatedly, written into the expedition plan, and signed by every member of the team. At 8:50, with the summit still several hundred vertical feet above them, the lead guide called a halt. Clouds were building to the west, wind speeds were increasing along the ridge, and Omar was moving far too slowly for the group to reach the summit and descend with a reasonable margin of safety. The guide pointed to the agreement and said it was time to turn around. Alejandro refused. He looked toward the summit, then at his family, and argued that they were already too close to stop. After everything they had invested in the climb, he believed turning around at that point would be a mistake. The guides disagreed, but the climb continued. You do have to wonder, if the guide's advice wasn't meant for moments like this, then what exactly was it meant for? Alejandro and Emil reached the summit at approximately 11:10 in the morning. Rima and Omar arrived roughly 30 minutes later. By then the weather had already begun deteriorating. The wind was strong enough to make standing difficult in exposed areas. Visibility was beginning to decrease, and temperatures were falling. There was no extended stop on the summit. A few photographs were taken, and the descent began almost immediately. The situation deteriorated quickly on the way down. The coordination problems that had slowed Omar during the ascent became far more noticeable. He responded slowly to instructions, struggled with routine movements, and at one point stopped on the fixed rope and appeared unsure where he was supposed to go next. Later, on an exposed traverse, he lost his footing entirely and fell several feet before the rope caught him. The fall did not seriously injure him, but recovering from it cost valuable time and left him visibly shaken. One of the guides took over his descent completely and remained clipped to him for the rest of the day. By the time the group returned to the top of the bottleneck, the weather had changed dramatically. Wind was driving snow across the mountain, and visibility had dropped to a fraction of what it had been during the ascent. The same route they had climbed only hours earlier now required a completely different level of effort and concentration. The descent through the bottleneck took more than 3 hours. Under favorable conditions, a team moving well might clear it in around 90 minutes. Omar could no longer manage the fixed ropes without direct assistance, and the guide attached to him was effectively moving him section by section. Rima continued descending, but she had become increasingly withdrawn. Questions were met with short replies or no reply at all. Alejandro was still moving under his own power, but the altitude was beginning to affect him as well. At one point he stopped and spent several moments staring at an ice wall beside the route, as though searching for a path that wasn't there. One of the guides redirected him back onto the fixed rope, and he followed without argument. For all the effort spent trying to control the risks, Alejandro was still breathing the same thin air as everyone else. The family finally cleared the bottleneck at around 4:15 in the afternoon. Below the bottleneck, the fixed ropes ended, and the remaining distance to Camp 4 had to be covered without that support. Camp 4 was still ahead of them, and under normal circumstances, the remaining distance would have been manageable. Under these circumstances, it wasn't. There was no possibility of outside rescue. Helicopters could not operate at that altitude, and the weather had already eliminated any realistic chance of assistance from below. From that point onward, survival depended entirely on what the climbers themselves were capable of doing. Omar was the first to collapse. Somewhere on the slope between the bottleneck and Camp 4, His body simply stopped keeping pace with the demands being placed on it. He lost consciousness while still attached to the fixed rope. Emil remained with him as the guides assessed the situation, but there was little anyone could realistically do at that altitude. Rima collapsed roughly an hour later. She was still alive when the guides reached her, but moving an incapacitated climber under those conditions was beyond the team's capability. The weather was worsening, daylight was fading, and every member of the group was already operating near their limits. She never recovered. Alejandro and Emil continued toward Camp 4. They came within a few hundred feet of the tents. Alejandro eventually sat down in the snow and was unable to continue. Emil managed to push on for a short distance longer before he stopped as well. The guides reached Camp 4 that evening. They were the only members of the team who did. The family's greatest strength and one of its greatest vulnerabilities turned out to be the same thing, always being on the same team. Radio contact with base camp was established at around 8 o'clock that evening. The guides reported that all 4 members of the Joubert family were unresponsive on the upper mountain, and that they themselves had reached Camp 4 in poor condition. The information was relayed through the expedition's support network, and a rescue assessment was carried out almost immediately. The conclusion came quickly. Weather conditions made any aerial approach impossible, and no ground team could reach climbers stranded above 26,000 feet before it was too late. The family was simply too high on the mountain and too far beyond assistance. There was nothing anyone could do. The guides descended to base camp the following day. The bodies were never recovered. On mountains like K2, recovery operations at those altitudes are rarely feasible even under favorable conditions. In the days that followed, weather on the upper mountain deteriorated further, eliminating any realistic possibility of reaching the area where the family had gone down. Their families never saw them again. The investigation that followed was conducted by the expedition's insurer alongside an independent mountaineering review. Both reached essentially the same conclusion. The family had succumbed to a combination of severe exhaustion, hypoxia, and exposure after becoming trapped high on the mountain during a descent that began too late and progressed too slowly. Investigators identified Omar's incomplete acclimatization as a contributing factor, along with the team's overall pace on summit day and the decision to continue climbing after the agreed turnaround time had passed. The lead guide's written log became an important part of the review. The entries documented the concerns he had raised throughout the climb, including weather assessments, recommendations to delay the summit push, and discussions regarding Omar's condition. Investigators found no evidence of equipment failure. The oxygen systems, communications equipment, and climbing gear all functioned as intended. The deaths were ultimately ruled the result of exposure and altitude-related deterioration. GPS data recovered from the team's devices provided a nearly complete record of the ascent and descent. The timestamps confirmed that the group had moved through the bottleneck on the way down at less than 1/3 of the pace required to reach Camp 4 before darkness and worsening weather overtook them.